In the mist-shrouded valleys of Blue Ridge, Colorado, where autumn winds carry both the promise of winter and the weight of unspoken sorrows, Jake Bennett's carefully constructed solitude was about to shatter like morning frost under the sun. For 3 years, he had lived as a ghost haunting his own ranch, finding refuge in the silence of the high country while his heart remained frozen in the moment everything changed. The Meadowbrook Ranch spread across 800 acres of pristine valley floor, but Jake made his home in a small cabin perched on the mountainside, as far from memories as geography would allow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The main ranch house sat empty below, its windows dark, while Carlos Mendez and his family maintained the day-to-day operations with quiet efficiency. They understood that some wounds needed space to heal, even if that healing seemed to stretch into years. But on this particular October evening, as storm clouds gathered over the peaks and the first snow of the season began to dust the aspens, a battered Honda Civic would wind its way up the mountain road, carrying with it a desperation that matched the gathering tempest. Emma Carter pressed her foot harder against the accelerator, though the winding mountain road demanded caution. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, and every few seconds she glanced at the rearview mirror, searching for the headlights that had been following her since Denver. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, as if sensing her fear, and she placed one protective hand over her 6-month belly, while steering with the other. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, but she kept driving deeper into the wilderness, following instincts that told her safety lay in isolation. The road narrowed to little more than a dirt track, forcing her to slow as rocks pinged against the undercarriage. Through the gathering darkness, she spotted a light flickering in the distance, a cabin, tucked against the tree line like a refuge from the world. Without hesitation, she turned onto what might have been a driveway, her car sliding slightly on the loose gravel before coming to a stop beside a weathered pickup truck. The silence that enveloped Jake Bennett each morning had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He rose before dawn, as he had every day for the past 3 years, moving through routines that kept the darkness at bay. Coffee brewed in the same blue enamel pot Lisa had bought at a flea market in Boulder. Breakfast eaten standing at the kitchen counter, staring out at peaks that caught the first light like promises he no longer believed. The empty chair across from his small table remained tucked under, unused, a daily reminder of the conversation that would never resume. His boots found their familiar path down the mountain trail to the main ranch buildings, where Carlos would already be feeding the horses. The rescue animals arrived broken, just as Jake preferred. Horses too damaged for most people to handle, carrying their own wounds that mirrored his own. There was Star, a mare who'd been so badly abused she wouldn't let anyone touch her face. Thunder, a gelding who'd bolt at the first sign of a raised voice. Belle, who'd arrived 3 months ago with scars across her flanks and terror in her eyes whenever someone approached with a rope. The work suited him. Damaged creatures required patience, silence, understanding without demands for conversation or explanations. They didn't ask why he chose to live alone on the mountain, why he avoided the main house where he'd planned to bring Lisa after their wedding. They didn't wonder why a man of 35 had retreated from life so completely that even his closest friend Carlos spoke to him in careful, measured tones. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Jake made his rounds through the paddocks, checking water troughs and hay supplies. Each horse received his attention, a quiet word of greeting, a gentle touch when they would allow it. This was his meditation, his prayer, his way of proving to himself that something good could still come from his hands. Even if those same hands had failed to pull Lisa from the rushing water when the flash flood swept through their campsite. Carlos appeared from the feed room, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that had become habitual over the past 3 years. "Morning, Jake. Anna's making extra breakfast if you want to come down to the house." The invitation was extended every few days, always gently, always without pressure. Anna Mendez had been trying to coax Jake back into human society with food and kindness since the accident, understanding that grief sometimes required community, even when the grieving person couldn't see it. Jake shook his head, offering a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, but I've got feed to distribute up at the north pasture. Maybe next time." They both knew there wouldn't be a next time, but the ritual of asking and declining had become their own form of conversation, a way of maintaining connection without demands for vulnerability. The North Pasture held his most challenging cases. Horses so traumatized that they required complete isolation from the herd until they could begin to trust again. As Jake approached the fence line, he noticed something that made him pause. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading toward his cabin. His first instinct was irritation. Carlos knew better than to send visitors up the mountain unannounced. But as he followed the tracks with his eyes, he saw the small car parked beside his truck, and something shifted in his chest. The Honda Civic looked like it had traveled hard miles, its bumper dented, one taillight cracked. Colorado plates, but covered with dust from what looked like several states. Most telling of all, the driver's side door stood ajar, as if whoever had been inside had left in a hurry, or in fear. Jake's pace quickened as he climbed back toward his cabin. 3 years of isolation had sharpened his instincts, and everything about the abandoned car suggested someone in trouble. As he crested the final rise, he could see his front door, which he distinctly remembered locking before his morning walk. The knob turned easily under his hand, confirming his suspicions. The woman sat curled in his reading chair beside the cold fireplace, a threadbare blanket pulled around her shoulders despite the October chill. She appeared to be sleeping, her dark hair falling across her face, but Jake could see the tension in her posture that spoke of exhaustion rather than rest. Her clothes looked expensive but wrinkled, as if she'd been wearing them for days. Most striking of all was the obvious curve of her pregnancy, her hands instinctively protective even in sleep. For a moment, Jake stood frozen in his own doorway, uncertain how to proceed. 3 years of avoiding human contact had left him unpracticed in social situations, especially ones as delicate as this clearly was. The woman stirred at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes opening with the startled alertness of
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
someone accustomed to danger. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, struggling to rise from the chair, her movements awkward with pregnancy and fatigue. "I thought the cabin was empty. I just needed somewhere to rest for a few hours." Her voice carried an educated accent, suggesting a background far removed from the rural mountain setting where she now found herself. Jake held up his hands in a gesture of peace, noting how she flinched at the movement. "Easy now. You're not in trouble. Just take it slow." He kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he used with the traumatized horses. "When's the last time you ate something?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if kindness was unexpected. "I'm not sure. Yesterday maybe. I've been driving since." She trailed off, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "I can pay you for the inconvenience. I have cash." Something about the offer troubled Jake. In his experience, people who led with cash were usually running from something, and pregnant women didn't typically find themselves sleeping in strangers' cabins without compelling reasons. "Keep your money," he said, moving slowly toward his small kitchen. "Coffee's still warm if you want some. Though maybe tea would be better for the baby." Emma watched him with the wariness of a wild creature, tracking his movements as he filled a kettle and set it on the propane stove. Everything about the cabin spoke of a man living alone by choice rather than circumstance. The furniture was handmade and well-maintained, the few personal items arranged with careful precision. No photographs were visible, but she could sense the weight of absent memories in the spaces between objects. "I'm Jake," he said, not turning around as he prepared the tea. "This is my place." He paused, considering his next words. "You're welcome to stay until you figure out your next move, but I need to know if someone's looking for you. If there's going to be trouble." The directness of his question cut through Emma's defenses. She'd been preparing lies and half-truths for days, but something about Jake's matter-of-fact tone made deception feel impossible. "My husband," she admitted quietly. "He's a police detective in Denver. He has connections everywhere. I took something from his files before I left, evidence of things he's been involved in. If he finds me..." Jake turned then, studying her face with the same careful attention he gave injured animals. He saw the fading bruises around her left wrist, partially hidden by her sleeves but visible when she reached for the blanket. The way she held herself suggested other injuries, older ones that had taught her to minimize her presence and avoid sudden movements. "Evidence of what?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her, keeping enough distance to avoid triggering her obvious anxiety. Emma's laugh held no humor. Drug money laundering through police evidence lockups. Payments to judges for favorable rulings in cases involving his friends. David's been using his badge to build a criminal network for years. I finally got proof, but he caught me copying files from his computer. Her hand moved to her cheek, where Jake could now see the faint outline of a handprint that makeup couldn't quite conceal. The kettle's whistle broke the tension, and Jake rose to pour the tea, giving Emma time to compose herself. When he returned, he noticed she'd straightened slightly, as if sharing her secret had lifted some invisible weight. "How far along?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. 6 months. She's due in February. The pronoun came naturally, though Emma realized she'd never told anyone else about the baby's gender. Something about Jake's calm presence made confidences feel safe. "And you've been driving since yesterday?" When she nodded, Jake frowned. "You need rest, proper food. Doctor probably wouldn't be too happy about you pushing yourself like this." He paused, studying her face. "Question is, what do you need from me? Just a place to catch your breath or something more?" Emma stared into her tea, watching steam curl toward the cabin's exposed rafters. For weeks she'd been focused entirely on escape, on getting far enough from David's reach to think clearly. She hadn't allowed herself to consider what came next, what kind of life she might build for herself and her daughter. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been on my own before. I married David straight out of college. I don't even know what I'm capable of." Jake recognized the uncertainty in her voice. It reminded him of the horses when they first arrived, so accustomed to pain that they couldn't imagine safety. "You made it this far," he pointed out. "Took evidence from a corrupt cop, got yourself hundreds of miles away from danger, found shelter when you needed it. Seems like you're more capable than you think." The observation hung between them as Emma considered it. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the cabin's windows and sending the first snowflakes swirling past the glass. The storm that had been threatening all evening was finally arriving, and with it, the realization that she might be staying longer than the few hours she'd originally planned. Jake seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Storm's moving in fast," he said, glancing toward the window. "Road down the mountain gets treacherous in snow, especially at night. You're welcome to stay until it passes. I've got a spare room, clean sheets. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and safe." The word safe resonated through Emma like a bell, a concept she'd almost forgotten. When was the last time she'd felt truly secure, able to let down her guard completely? Certainly not in the months since she'd discovered David's criminal activities, and probably not for years before that. Living with him had been like walking on ice, never knowing when the surface might crack beneath her feet. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me except that I broke into your house and I'm running from a cop." Most people would have called for help by now. Jake considered the question, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug as he stared into the fire he'd built while she slept. "Maybe because I know something about running from things that hurt," he said eventually. "And maybe because you remind me that there are still problems in this world that need solving, even if I can't solve my own." Emma studied his profile in the firelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of someone who'd aged beyond his years. The careful way he held himself that suggested his own form of brokenness. "What are you running from?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Jake's instinct was to deflect, to retreat behind the walls he'd built so carefully over the past 3 years. But something about Emma's presence in his space, her willingness to trust him with her story, made his usual defenses feel inadequate. "Guilt," he said, finally. "The kind that follows you no matter how far you run." He set down his mug, his hands steady despite the emotion in his voice. "I was supposed to protect someone I loved, and I failed. She died because of a choice I made, a place I picked for us to camp. Flash flood took her while I watched from 20 feet away." Emma felt her breath catch at the raw pain in his admission. "How long ago?" 3 years, 4 months, 16 days. The precision of his answer revealed how completely the loss had taken over his life. "Her name was Lisa. We were going to be married that Christmas." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind outside and the soft crackling of the fire. Emma understood now why Jake lived alone on the mountain, why his cabin felt like a place of exile rather than choice. Grief had its own geography, and some people needed physical distance to match the emotional space their loss required. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That kind of loss, I can't imagine." Jake nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without minimizing it. "Point is, we both ended up here for reasons that aren't entirely our choice. Maybe that means we can help each other figure out what comes next." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the constant tension that had become her normal state. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she didn't have to face the future entirely alone. Outside, snow continued to fall, and the isolation that had drawn Jake to this mountain was now protecting them both from the storms they'd been running from. The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if reminding Emma that her choices affected more than just herself. She placed her hand over the movement, feeling her daughter's restless energy. "She's active tonight," she said, surprised at how natural it felt to share this small intimacy with a virtual stranger. "Probably responding to your stress levels settling down," Jake observed. "Animals do the same thing. They can sense when their environment becomes safer." He paused, then added, "You said she. You know it's a girl." Emma nodded. "Found out last month right before I discovered what David was really doing. I haven't even picked a name yet. Everything's been so chaotic." She looked down at her belly, her expression softening. "I wanted to wait until I knew what kind of world I was bringing her into." Jake found himself studying Emma's face as she spoke about her daughter, noting how the wariness faded when she focused on the baby. It reminded him of the breakthrough moments with the rescue horses, when they stopped seeing everything as a potential threat and allowed themselves to simply exist in the present moment. "Well," he said, rising to add another log to the fire, "for tonight at least, she's in a world where she's safe and warm, with a mother brave enough to do whatever it takes to protect her. That seems like a pretty good start." As the flames caught and flared, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of escape she'd carried during her flight from Denver, but something quieter and more sustainable. The hope that comes from recognizing kindness in unexpected places, from discovering that even in the darkest circumstances, human decency still exists. Outside, the storm continued to build, blanketing the mountain in snow that would make travel impossible until morning. But inside Jake's cabin, two wounded souls had found temporary shelter, not just from the weather, but from the storms that had been pursuing them long before this night began. Neither of them knew yet that by morning, the simple act of sharing space and stories would have set in motion a healing process that would transform both their lives completely. The spare room Jake offered contained a single bed, with a handmade quilt, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley below. Emma stood in the doorway, taking in the Spartan but comfortable space. Like everything else in the cabin, it felt carefully maintained but unused, as if Jake had been waiting for a visitor who never came. "Bathroom's just down the hall," he said, setting her small overnight bag on the dresser. "Hot water takes a few minutes, but there's plenty of it. I keep basic supplies stocked." He paused at the door, his expression uncertain. "If you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to knock. I'm not much of a sleeper anyway." Emma watched him retreat down the hallway, struck by the careful consideration he showed despite their circumstances. She'd grown so accustomed to David's unpredictable moods, his tendency to view any need she expressed as an inconvenience, that Jake's straightforward kindness felt almost foreign. When was the last time someone had offered her comfort without expecting something in return? The hot shower proved to be everything Jake had promised, and Emma stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting the water wash away not just the grime of travel, but some of the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders and neck. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel that smelled of mountain air and detergent, she realized she felt more human than she had in weeks. Through the small window, she could see snow falling steadily now, the flakes illuminated by the porch light, like stars against the darkness. The Honda Civic had already acquired a white coating, and Emma felt a mixture of relief and anxiety at the sight. The storm that trapped her here also meant David couldn't reach her. At least, not tonight. For the first time in months, she could sleep without fear of waking to his key in the lock, his voice demanding explanations she couldn't give. As she settled into the unfamiliar bed, Emma placed her hands on her belly, feeling her daughter's quieter movements as they both prepared for rest. "We're safe tonight," she whispered to her unborn child. "I don't know what tomorrow brings, but tonight we're safe." Down the hall, Jake sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and staring into the dying fire. Having someone else in his space felt strange after years of solitude, but not unpleasant. Emma's presence somehow made the cabin feel more like a home and less like a hiding place. Her stories had reminded him that life continued beyond his mountain refuge, that people still needed help, still faced challenges that required courage and determination. For 3 years, he convinced himself that his isolation served a purpose, that removing himself from society protected others from his poor judgment, his inability to make the right choices when they mattered most. But Emma's arrival had introduced a complication he hadn't anticipated. She needed help, and despite his self-imposed exile, he found himself wanting to provide it. The baby changed everything, of course. Jake had always been protective of vulnerable creatures, whether they were injured horses or lost hikers who occasionally wandered onto his property. But the thought of Emma facing single motherhood while fleeing from a dangerous husband awakened something in him that had been dormant since Lisa's death. Purpose, the sense that his actions might matter to someone other than himself. Outside, an owl called from the forest, its voice lonely and wild in the winter night. Jake listened to the sound, remembering how Lisa used to imitate the calls during their camping trips, delighting in the responses that echoed back from the darkness. The memory came without the usual stab of pain, softened somehow by Emma's presence in his home. As the fire burned down to coals, and the cabin settled into the deep quiet of a snow-covered night, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. Whatever Emma needed from him, whatever help he could provide, he would give freely, not because he sought redemption for his past failures, but because she'd reminded him that sometimes the best way to heal your own wounds is to help someone else heal theirs. Morning crept across the valley like spilled honey, golden and slow, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of amber and rose. Emma woke to silence so complete it felt alien after months of city noise and the constant tension of listening for David's footsteps. The baby stirred gently within her, a flutter of movement that had become her most trusted companion during the long nights of driving in fear. Through the small window, she could see the world transform. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, creating drifts that reached halfway up the fence posts, and turning the mountain landscape into something from a fairy tale. Her car had disappeared entirely under a white mound, making departure impossible even if she'd wanted to leave. The scent of coffee and something sweet drifted under her door, along with the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. Jake was already awake, probably had been for hours if his habits matched those of the ranchers she'd known growing up in rural Nebraska. Her stomach growled in response to the food smells, reminding her that she'd eaten almost nothing in the past 2 days. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jake standing at the stove, his back to her as he flipped what appeared to be pancakes. He'd changed from yesterday's work clothes into clean jeans and a flannel shirt that stretched across his shoulders, and his dark hair was still damp from a shower. The domestic scene felt surreal after the chaos of her recent life. "Sleep okay?" he asked without turning around, as if he'd sensed her presence in the doorway. "Better than I have in months," Emma admitted, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. "The quiet here is incredible. I'd forgotten what real silence sounds like." Jake glanced over his shoulder, noting the way she moved more slowly this morning, the cautious way she lowered herself into the chair. "Baby keeping you uncomfortable?" "She's just running out of room," Emma said, placing both hands on her belly. "Doctor?" Martinez told me to expect this as we get closer to the due date. Everything's normal, just crowded. He nodded, flipping the last pancake before turning off the burner. Carlos's wife Anna went through the same thing with their youngest. Said it felt like carrying a watermelon that never stopped moving. He paused, studying Emma's face. When's the last time you saw a doctor? The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity, and Emma felt her defenses rise automatically. 3 weeks ago, everything was fine then. She didn't mention that she'd paid cash for that appointment, or that she'd given a false name, or that Dr. Martinez had expressed concern about her stress levels, and suggested she consider counseling for what he diplomatically called life transitions. Jake set a plate of pancakes in front of her, along with real maple syrup and butter that tasted like it had come from a local dairy. The food was simple but perfectly prepared, and Emma found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. These are incredible, she said between bites. Lisa taught me, Jake said quietly, settling into his own chair with a mug of coffee. She said anyone who lived alone needed to know how to make at least one thing that felt like comfort food. The mention of his lost fiancée came naturally, without the sharp edge of pain Emma had heard the night before. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was a teacher, Jake said. Elementary school, down in Pine Creek. Kids loved her because she treated them like they had important things to say. He stared out the window at the snow-covered valley. She would have loved mornings like this. Used to say fresh snow made the whole world look possible again. Emma heard the shift in his voice. The way talking about Lisa seemed to both comfort and wound him. How long were you together? 5 years. Met her at a fundraiser for the animal rescue program the county was starting. She was there because she wanted her students to visit the ranch, see how we rehabilitate damaged horses. I was there because Carlos insisted I needed to get out more. A small smile crossed his face. She cornered me by the dessert table and spent an hour asking questions about animal psychology. Most intelligent conversation I'd had in years. The image of Jake being cornered by an enthusiastic teacher made Emma smile despite her own circumstances. She sounds persistent, determined, Jake corrected. Once Lisa decided something was important, she didn't let obstacles stop her. That's what got her killed, in the end. She was determined to help me face my fear of camping after my father died in a hiking accident. Insisted we go to this spot up in Rocky Mountain National Park. Said I couldn't let old fears keep me from experiencing beautiful places. Emma set down her fork, recognizing the guilt that crept into his voice. The flash flood wasn't your fault. I picked the campsite, Jake said simply. Weather reports showed possible storms, but I thought we'd be far enough from the main creek. Lisa trusted my judgment, and I was wrong. Water came through our camp at midnight, carrying half the mountainside with it. I managed to grab onto a tree when the current hit us, but Lisa, he stopped, his knuckles white around his coffee mug. She was swept away while you watched, Emma finished softly. Jake nodded, the words still too difficult to speak aloud. Search teams found her body 3 days later, 15 miles downstream. By then, I'd already started planning how to disappear from the world. Couldn't stand the sympathy. The well-meaning people telling me it wasn't my fault when I knew better. Emma understood that kind of guilt, the weight of choices that seemed reasonable at the time but led
to devastating consequences. I used to blame myself for staying with David as long as I did, she said quietly. People would ask why I didn't leave sooner, why I didn't see the signs of what he was becoming. Even now, I wonder if I could have prevented some of what happened by acting differently. What finally made you leave? Emma touched her belly, feeling the baby's morning stretches. This little one. When I found out I was pregnant, David's first reaction was to demand I get an abortion. Said a baby would interfere with his career plans, make him look too domestic for the promotions he wanted. When I refused, he started getting physical about it. Jake's expression darkened. He hit you because you wouldn't terminate the pregnancy. Among other reasons. David needs to control everything in his environment, and a baby represents chaos he can't manage. But the final straw was discovering his criminal activities. I realized I couldn't bring a child into a home where her father was laundering drug money and taking bribes. What kind of life would that be for her? The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road. Jake rose immediately, moving to the window with an alertness that reminded Emma of a guard dog sensing potential threat. Through the falling snow, they could see Carlos's pickup truck making its way carefully up the icy track. "My foreman," Jake explained, but his posture remained tense until the truck came to a complete stop and Carlos emerged alone. "He's probably wondering about the extra car, making sure everything's okay up here." Carlos Mendez proved to be a compact man in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors. His eyes took in Emma's presence with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations accurately. But his expression remained carefully neutral. "Morning, Jake. Wanted to check on you before the storm gets worse." His voice carried a slight accent and his tone held the easy familiarity of long friendship. "Road's getting pretty rough. Might be a few days before anyone can get up or down the mountain safely." Jake made quick introductions, explaining Emma's presence without going into details about why she'd arrived in the middle of the night. Carlos accepted the explanation with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he'd probably show any stranded traveler, but Emma caught him studying her with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to notice things others might miss. "Anna sent food," Carlos said, retrieving a covered basket from his truck. "Figured you might need supplies if you're going to be stuck up here for a while." He handed the basket to Jake, then turned to Emma. "She also sent some things she thought you might need. Women's supplies, that sort of thing. Said to tell you if there's anything else, just let us know." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of people who didn't even know her. "That's incredibly kind. Please tell your wife thank you. Anna's good at taking care of people," Carlos said simply. "It's what she does." He paused, studying Emma's face. "You holding up okay? Baby giving you any trouble?" "Everything's fine," Emma assured him, though she appreciated his concern. "Just tired from traveling." Carlos nodded, but Emma could see him noting details that might become important later. Her expensive but wrinkled clothes, the careful way she moved that suggested someone accustomed to being on guard, the fading bruises on her wrist that weren't quite hidden by her sleeves. "Jake, I need to talk to you about Thunder," Carlos said, changing the subject with practiced ease. "He's been acting strange since yesterday. Won't let anyone near him. Anna thinks he might be coming down with something, but I wonder if he's just picking up on the storm energy. Animals get nervous when the weather's about to turn bad." Emma listened to their conversation about the troubled horse, noting how Jake's entire demeanor changed when discussing the animals. His voice became gentler, more animated, as if the horses represented a language he spoke fluently while human interaction required translation. "I'll come down and look at him after the snow stops," Jake promised. "Might just need some quiet time. Thunder's been through more trauma than most of them. Takes longer for horses like that to trust their environment." "Like people," Emma said without thinking, then felt both men look at her curiously. "I mean, I've noticed that animals who've been hurt badly often need more time to feel safe than those who've had easier lives. It makes sense that emotional trauma would work the same way." Carlos smiled, the expression warming his weathered features. "You know horses. I grew up around them," Emma said. "My grandfather had a small ranch in Nebraska. I was studying to be a veterinarian before I got married and changed direction." She paused, realizing she hadn't thought about that abandoned dream in years. "I always loved working with animals. They're honest in ways people often aren't." Jake set down his coffee mug, studying Emma with new interest. "What made you stop?" David thought veterinary medicine was too messy, too unpredictable for a wife. He preferred I focus on what he called more appropriate interests: art history, interior design, charity work that would help his social standing. Emma's voice carried a bitter edge. "I let him convince me that my own dreams weren't practical." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Carlos exchanged a look with Jake that spoke of conversations they'd had about controlling relationships. About the ways some people used love as a weapon to reshape their partners into more convenient versions of themselves. "It's never too late to go back to what you love," Carlos said quietly. "Anna went back to school when our youngest started kindergarten. Became a nurse at 42. Best decision she ever made." Emma felt something stir inside her chest, a flutter of possibility she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. I'd have to start over completely. My transcripts, my applications, everything's probably gone by now. Records don't disappear, Jake said matter-of-factly. And skills don't either. If you wanted to work with animals again, there are ways to make it happen. He gestured toward the window, where snow continued to fall steadily. Might be worth thinking about while we're snowed in. What you'd want your life to look like if you could design it from scratch. The conversation was interrupted by Carlos's radio crackling to life. Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the static, requesting Carlos's assistance with a situation down in the valley. Something about a stranded motorist and a possible medical emergency. I have to go, Carlos said, gathering his coat. Storm's bringing out the worst drivers, people who think four-wheel drive makes them invincible. He paused at the door, looking back at Emma. Anna wanted me to tell you you're welcome to come down to the main house anytime you want company. She knows how quiet it can get up here on the mountain. After Carlos left, Emma found herself alone with Jake again, but the dynamic between them had shifted subtly. His revelation about Lisa's teaching background and her own confession about abandoned veterinary studies had created a different kind of intimacy. One based on shared dreams rather than just shared circumstances. Would you like to see the horses? Jake asked as they finished cleaning up from breakfast. Storm's not supposed to let up until this afternoon, but the barn's only a short walk. Might do you good to get some fresh air. Emma nodded eagerly, realizing how much she'd missed being around animals. David had been allergic to pet dander, or claimed to be, making it impossible for her to have so much as a goldfish in their Denver apartment. The thought of spending time with horses again felt like returning to a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. The barn proved to be a masterpiece of rustic construction, with high ceilings and wide aisles that allowed natural light to filter through strategically placed windows. The air smelled of hay and leather, and the warm, comforting scent of horses, a combination that transported Emma instantly back to childhood mornings spent helping her grandfather with feeding routines. Jake led her to the first stall, where a bay mare, with intelligent eyes, watched their approach with cautious interest. "This is Star," he said, his voice dropping to the gentle tone Emma had noticed earlier. "She came to us 8 months ago from a situation where she'd been beaten regularly around the head. Still won't let anyone touch her face, but she's made incredible progress in other areas." Emma studied the horse's body language, noting the way Star held her ears and the careful distance she maintained from the stall door. "She's beautiful. What's her background?" "Thoroughbred, probably raced at some point based on her build. Owner got frustrated when she wouldn't perform, started using increasingly violent training methods. By the time animal control removed her, she was so traumatized she'd attack anyone who came near." Jake extended his hand slowly, allowing Star to investigate his scent. "Took 3 months before she'd take food from me directly." Emma watched the careful choreography between man and horse, impressed by Jake's patience and the obvious trust that had developed between them. "How do you know when they're ready for more contact?" "They tell you if you know how to listen." Star started following me around the paddock about 2 months ago, staying just out of reach, but clearly wanting interaction. Last week, she let me touch her shoulder for the first time. Small steps, but each one means she's choosing to trust a little more. They moved down the barn aisle, Jake introducing Emma to each of the rescue horses and sharing their stories. There was Thunder, a massive draft horse who'd been used for illegal fighting before his rescue. Belle, a paint mare, who'd been starved nearly to death by owners who'd abandoned her when they could no longer afford feed. Each animal carried visible and invisible scars, but Emma could see the healing that had taken place under Jake's care. "It's incredible what you've accomplished with them," she said as they reached the end of the barn. "These horses are lucky to have found you." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Carlos does most of the daily work. I just provide the space and time they need to figure out that not all humans are dangerous." "That's not true, and you know it," Emma said firmly. "What you've done here requires more than just space and time. It takes understanding, patience, and the ability to see past the damage to the whole animal underneath." "That's a gift, Jake." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. You talk like someone who understands trauma recovery. Emma touched her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. I'm learning. Every day, I discover something else David took from me. Confidence, dreams, the ability to trust my own judgment. Some days I feel like these horses so damaged I don't know if I'll ever be whole again. But you left, Jake pointed out. Despite everything he put you through, despite being pregnant and alone, you found the strength to leave. That takes incredible courage. Or incredible desperation, Emma said with a bitter laugh. I'm not sure there's much difference. There is, Jake said quietly. Desperation is about running away from something. Courage is about moving toward something better, even when you can't see what that looks like yet. He paused, watching Thunder investigate a new hay net. These horses teach me that healing isn't about forgetting what happened to you. It's about learning to trust again, one small step at a time. Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved by the simple wisdom in his words. How long does it take? As long as it takes, Jake said. Every animal is different. Every situation unique. But I've never met a horse that couldn't heal if given enough time and the right environment. He turned to face her directly. Same goes for people, I imagine. They spent the rest of the morning in the barn, Emma helping with feeding routines and simple maintenance tasks. Her veterinary training proved useful as she assessed the horses' conditions and asked informed questions about their care. Jake watched her work with growing admiration, noting how naturally she moved around the animals and how quickly they responded to her calm presence. You're good at this, he said, as Emma examined a small cut on Belle's leg. The horses can sense you know what you're doing. Emma smiled, feeling more like herself than she had in years. It feels right, being around them again. I'd forgotten how much I missed it. She straightened, one hand automatically going to her lower back. David always said animals were dirty, unpredictable. Made it sound like my interest in them was somehow childish or inappropriate for an adult. Sounds like David had strong opinions about a lot of things that weren't his business to control. Jake observed. He did. Still does, I imagine. Emma's expression darkened as she remembered her husband's tendency to micromanage every aspect of her life. He probably has people looking for me right now, calling in favors from other departments, using his badge to access resources most people couldn't touch. Jake leaned against Belle's stall, studying Emma's face. How long do you think it'll take him to track you this far? I'm not sure. I paid cash for gas, stayed off main highways, turned off my phone after I left Denver. But David's smart, and he has connections everywhere. If he really wants to find me, he probably will eventually. The admission hung between them like a challenge, forcing both to confront the temporary nature of Emma's sanctuary on the mountain. Outside, snow continued to fall, but they both knew the storm would end eventually, and with it, the illusion of perfect safety that the isolation provided. Then we'll have to make sure you're ready for whatever comes next. Jake said finally. Starting with getting you proper medical care and making sure you have legal protection if you need it. Emma looked at him in surprise. We. Jake met her eyes steadily. You helped me remember this morning that there are still problems in the world worth solving. Still people who need protection from those who'd hurt them. Maybe that's what I've been missing these past 3 years, sitting up here feeling sorry for myself. Jake, you don't understand what you'd be getting into. David isn't just an abusive husband. He's a corrupt cop with criminal connections and the resources to make life very difficult for anyone who gets in his way. Then it's a good thing I don't have much of a life for him to disrupt. Jake said with a grim smile. Besides, you said yourself you have evidence of his criminal activities. Maybe it's time someone used that evidence to put him where he belongs. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear that had dominated her thoughts for weeks. For the first time since discovering David's corruption, she allowed herself to imagine fighting back instead of just running away. The possibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It would be dangerous, she warned. For both of us. Jake looked around the barn at the horses he'd spent years rehabilitating. Animals that had found the courage to trust again despite everything they'd endured. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all, he said quietly. These horses taught me that healing requires risk. You can't build a new life by staying safe in the shadows forever. As if in response to his words, Star approached her stall door and extended her neck toward Emma, allowing her to stroke the mare's velvet nose for the first time. The gesture felt like a blessing, a sign that trust was indeed possible even after the worst betrayals. Emma looked into the horse's dark eyes and saw her own reflection, wounded but not broken, afraid but still fighting. For the first time in months, she began to believe that escape might not be enough. Maybe it was time to stop running and start reclaiming the life David had stolen from her, one careful step at a time. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived at the cabin 3 days later, her four-wheel drive Subaru crunching through the packed snow with the confidence of someone who'd been making house calls in mountain country for over 2 decades. Emma watched from the window as the petite Korean-American woman emerged from her vehicle, black medical bag in hand, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd learned to work in all-weather conditions. Jake met her at the door with obvious relief. He'd been growing increasingly concerned about Emma's condition, noting the way she'd been favoring her left side and the occasional grimaces that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. When Anna Mendez had offered to call Dr. Kim for a house visit, Jake had accepted immediately, despite Emma's protests that everything was fine. "Sarah, thanks for coming up in this weather," Jake said, taking her coat and medical bag. "I know the road's still pretty rough." Dr. Kim smiled, brushing snow from her short black hair. "I've made worse drives for less important patients. Besides, Anna made it sound urgent, and I trust her instincts about these things." She turned to Emma, who had risen carefully from the kitchen table where she'd been reading one of Jake's veterinary journals. "You must be Emma. I'm Dr. Kim, but everyone calls me Sarah." Emma felt her automatic defenses rise, the same wariness that had kept her alive during the final months of her marriage to David. "I appreciate you coming, but I'm really fine. I don't want to waste your time or Jake's money." Sarah's expression remained pleasantly neutral, but Emma caught the way the doctor's trained eyes took inventory of her posture, her coloring, the careful way she moved. "Well, since I'm already here, why don't we just make sure everything's progressing normally? Anna mentioned you haven't had regular prenatal care recently." The gentle but persistent tone reminded Emma of her grandfather's veterinarian, Dr. Hayes, who'd had the same ability to make examinations feel routine rather than invasive. She found herself nodding agreement before her conscious mind could raise objections. The examination took place in Emma's bedroom, with Jake waiting respectfully in the kitchen while Sarah conducted a thorough assessment. The doctor's hands were gentle but thorough as she checked Emma's blood pressure, listened to the baby's heartbeat, and measured her growing belly. "Everything sounds strong and healthy," Sarah announced, helping Emma sit up on the bed. "Baby's heartbeat is excellent. Position feels good for this stage of pregnancy. How have you been feeling overall?" Emma considered lying, offering the standard fine that had become her default response to personal questions. But something about Sarah's matter-of-fact kindness made honesty feel safer. "Tired, anxious, sometimes I have pain in my ribs when she kicks, and I've been having trouble sleeping. The rib pain is normal at this stage. Baby's running out of room and starting to press against your organs. As for the sleep issues and anxiety, that's understandable given your circumstances." Sarah's tone remained clinically professional, but Emma heard the underlying compassion. "Anna filled me in on the basics of your situation. You're dealing with a lot of stress that can't be good for you or the baby." Emma's hands moved instinctively to her belly. "Is she okay? The stress isn't hurting her, is it?" Babies are remarkably resilient, but prolonged maternal stress can have effects. Elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep patterns, poor appetite, all of these things can impact fetal development. Sarah sat down in the room's single chair, her expression becoming more personal. "Emma, I need to ask you some questions that might be difficult, but they're important for both your safety and the baby's." Emma nodded, though her throat suddenly felt tight. Are you currently in immediate physical danger? Do you have injuries that need treatment? Are you afraid someone might find you here and hurt you? The direct questions cut through Emma's carefully constructed defenses. She found herself describing the escalating violence of her final weeks with David, the bruises that had finally faded, the fear that still woke her in the night. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally making notes but never interrupting. Have you considered going to law enforcement about the abuse? Sarah asked when Emma finished. Emma's laugh was bitter. David is law enforcement. He's a detective with the Denver Police Department, and he has friends throughout the state. Who would I report him to? His supervisor, his partner. They all protect each other. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. I've seen this before. Police officers who abuse their families often have networks that make it nearly impossible for victims to get help through normal channels. She paused, considering her words carefully. There are other options though. Federal agencies that investigate police corruption, victim advocacy groups that specialize in law enforcement domestic violence cases. Would you be interested in speaking with someone who has experience with these situations? Emma felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror. You know people who help with cases like mine. I volunteer with a network of medical professionals who provide care to victims of law enforcement abuse. It's a specialized area because the usual resources often aren't sufficient when the abuser has a badge and connections throughout the justice system. Sarah pulled a business card from her pocket, but instead of her own information, it contained contact details for someone named Rebecca Martinez, MSW. Rebecca specializes in these cases. She can explain your options better than I can. Emma stared at the card, feeling as though she were being offered a lifeline she'd never imagined existed. What kinds of options? Safe houses that aren't connected to local law enforcement. Legal advocates who understand federal jurisdiction in police corruption cases. Medical care that doesn't create records David could access through his connections. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Emma, what you've described isn't just domestic abuse. If David is using police resources to track you, that's a federal crime. If he's threatened to use his position to harm you or take your child, that's another federal crime. The evidence you mentioned taking from his files could be crucial in building a case against him. The baby chose that moment to kick strongly, as if reminding Emma that her decisions affected more than just herself. She placed her hand over the movement, drawing strength from her daughter's restless energy. It would mean fighting back instead of just hiding, Emma said slowly. Yes. And it would be dangerous, at least initially. David will escalate when he realizes you're not just running away anymore, that you're actively building a case against him. Sarah's expression was serious, but hiding indefinitely isn't sustainable either, especially with a baby coming. You need medical care, legal documentation for your daughter's birth, eventually some kind of income and housing stability. All of those things create paper trails that someone with David's resources can follow. Emma looked around Jake's spare bedroom, at the simple furniture and mountain views that had become her refuge. Jake's been incredibly generous, but I can't stay here forever. This isn't his problem to solve. Have you asked Jake how he feels about that? Before Emma could respond, a soft knock came at the bedroom door. Jake's voice carried through the wood, carefully respectful. Sarah, sorry to interrupt, but Carlos just radioed. There's a situation down at the main ranch that needs your attention. One of the horses is injured. Sarah rose immediately, gathering her medical equipment. Professional hazard of being the only doctor within 50 miles who also treats large animals, she explained to Emma. We'll continue this conversation later, but I want you to think about what we discussed. And Emma, don't make any major decisions while you're feeling overwhelmed. Give yourself time to consider all your options. After Sarah left with Jake to tend to the injured horse, Emma found herself alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. The silence that had initially felt comforting now seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. She sat at Jake's kitchen table, Rebecca Martinez's business card in one hand and the other resting on her belly. The baby moved constantly now, her daughter's energy a reminder that time was running short. In less than 3 months, Emma would give birth, and then what? How could she raise a child while constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for David to appear with his badge and his threats and his connections that reached into every corner of law enforcement? She thought about Jake's words in the barn, about how healing required risk, how you couldn't build a new life by staying safe in the shadows forever. The rescue horses had taught him that trust was possible even after the worst betrayals. Maybe they could teach her the same lesson. Emma picked up her phone, the device she'd kept turned off since fleeing Denver. Her hands shook slightly as she powered it on, knowing that even this simple act might create a signal David could track. But some risks were necessary if she wanted to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. Rebecca Martinez answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. Rebecca Martinez speaking. My name is Emma Carter. Dr. Sarah Kim gave me your number. She said you might be able to help me with a situation involving my police officer husband. The conversation that followed lasted over an hour, with Rebecca asking detailed questions about David's abuse, his criminal activities, and the evidence Emma had gathered. By the end, Emma felt both terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Your case has several elements that make it particularly strong, Rebecca explained. The evidence of corruption you gathered, the pattern of escalating domestic violence, and his use of police resources to track and threaten you. We can definitely build a federal case, but you need to understand what you're committing to. What do you mean? Fighting back against a corrupt police officer isn't like a typical domestic violence case. David will use every resource at his disposal to discredit you, intimidate witnesses, and make your life as difficult as possible. He'll probably try to have you, declared an unfit mother, use his connections to question your mental state, maybe even arrange for you to be arrested on fabricated charges. Emma felt her stomach drop. Then maybe I should just keep running. Running has its own risks. David's already demonstrated he can track you across state lines. What happens when you go into labor? When you need to register your daughter for school? When you apply for jobs or housing? Every interaction with official systems creates opportunities for him to find you. The truth of Rebecca's words settled over Emma like a weight. There was no perfect solution, no choice that didn't involve significant risk. The question was whether she wanted to spend the rest of her life as a victim of David's abuse, or take the chance of becoming something more. If I decide to fight back, what would that look like? First, we'd arrange for you to give your statement to federal investigators in a secure
Location. The evidence you gathered would be analyzed by experts who specialize in police corruption cases. We'd also connect you with medical professionals and counselors who understand the specific trauma of law enforcement domestic violence. Emma thought about Jake's quiet strength, about the way he'd offered protection without question when she'd arrived at his door. What about the people helping me now? Would they be in danger? Anyone who's provided you aid could potentially become a target for intimidation or retaliation. That's why we work with local law enforcement agencies that are completely separate from your husband's sphere of influence. Sheriff Bradley in Pine Creek, for example, has worked with us before on cases involving corrupt officers from other departments. The mention of Sheriff Bradley gave Emma pause. She'd heard Jake and Carlos speak of him with respect, describing him as someone who'd grown up in the valley and cared more about protecting his community than advancing his career. Could she trust him with the truth about David's activities? I need time to think about this, Emma said finally. Of course. But Emma, if you're going to make a move, don't wait too long. Your husband's colleagues are probably already helping him track your movements, and the longer you stay in one place, the easier you'll be to find. After ending the call, Emma sat in Jake's kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered valley. Through the window, she could see him returning from the barn, his tall frame moving with easy confidence across the familiar terrain. He'd built a life here based on healing and protection, creating sanctuary for damaged creatures who needed time and space to recover from their wounds. But even sanctuaries couldn't provide absolute safety forever. Emma thought about the horses in Jake's barn, how they'd eventually need to venture beyond the protected paddocks if they were going to live full lives. Some risks were necessary for growth, and some fights were worth having even when the outcome was uncertain.
When Jake entered the cabin, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat on the peg by the door, Emma was waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a decision that would change both their lives. "How's the injured horse?" she asked as he settled into the chair across from her. Belle stepped on a loose nail in the paddock. Sarah cleaned the wound and gave her antibiotics, but she'll need daily care for the next week or so. Jake studied Emma's face, noting something different in her expression. "You look like you've been thinking hard about something." Emma pushed Rebecca Martinez's business card across the table. "I talked to this woman today. She specializes in cases involving abusive police officers. She thinks we can build a federal case against David, but it would mean fighting back instead of hiding." Jake picked up the card, reading the information carefully. "What do you want to do?" "I want to fight. I want to make sure David can't hurt anyone else the way he's hurt me. I want my daughter to grow up in a world where her mother stood up to a bully instead of spending her life running away." Emma's voice grew stronger with each word. "But I need to know that you understand what you'd be getting into by helping me. Rebecca said David will target anyone who's given me aid. He might try to hurt you, damage your ranch, use his connections to make your life difficult." Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains where the last light of day painted the peaks in shades of gold and purple. When he spoke, his voice carried the same certainty Emma had heard when he talked about the horses. "3 years ago, I failed to protect someone I loved, and I've been punishing myself for that failure ever since. Maybe that's what I needed to go through to be ready for this moment, to understand what real protection looks like." He met her eyes across the table. "Emma, you and that baby represent everything I should have been fighting for all along. If David wants to get to you, he'll have to go through me first." The simple declaration hit Emma with unexpected force. David had spent their entire marriage convincing her that she was weak, helpless, dependent on his protection for survival. But Jake saw her as someone worth protecting, not because she was helpless, but because she was valuable, because her fight against David represented something larger than just one woman's struggle for freedom. "It won't be easy," she warned. "David's smart, connected, and he's been planning for the possibility that I might try to expose him. He probably has lawyers, allies in federal agencies, ways of discrediting evidence that I can't even imagine. Then we'll have to be smarter," Jake said simply. "And we won't be fighting alone. Rebecca Martinez specializes in these cases because there are others like you, other victims who've found the courage to stand up to corrupt officers. You'll be part of a network, not an isolated target." Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes, but for the first time in months they were tears of relief rather than fear. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good. Fear keeps you careful, and we're going to need to be very careful about how we handle this." Jake reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. "But we're also going to need to be brave, and you've already proven you have more courage than you know." The baby kicked strongly, as if agreeing with Jake's assessment, and Emma smiled through her tears. "She's going to grow up knowing her mother fought back. She's going to grow up knowing she was worth fighting for," Jake corrected gently. As night settled over the mountain valley, Emma began making the calls that would transform her from a fugitive into a fighter. Rebecca Martinez connected her with federal investigators who specialized in police corruption. Sarah Kim provided detailed medical documentation of Emma's injuries and stress-related symptoms. Sheriff Bradley, when contacted through Rebecca's network, offered to coordinate with federal agents while keeping local law enforcement in Pine Creek completely separate from any information that might reach David's colleagues. Each conversation brought both progress and new challenges. The federal investigators were interested in Emma's evidence but warned that building a case would take months, possibly over a year. The medical documentation would be crucial for establishing a pattern of abuse, but Emma would need to provide testimony that would inevitably become public during trial proceedings. Sheriff Bradley could offer local protection, but his jurisdiction was limited, and David's connections extended far beyond Colorado. By midnight, Emma had committed to a course of action that felt both terrifying and liberating. She would work with federal investigators to build a corruption case against David, while simultaneously filing for divorce and seeking protective orders through the federal court system. The baby would be born under federal protection, with medical care provided by doctors who had no connection to David's network of influence. Jake listened to each development with the focused attention of someone planning a complex campaign. His experience managing the ranch had taught him the importance of preparation, backup plans, and contingency strategies. As Emma outlined the steps Rebecca Martinez had recommended, he began considering what additional security measures they might need. We should assume David already knows you're in Colorado, he said, when Emma finished her summary. Rebecca's network is secure, but he's been tracking you for weeks. He's probably narrowed your location down to this general area. Emma nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. Rebecca said we should expect him to escalate once he realizes I'm building a case against him instead of just hiding. Then we need to be ready for escalation. Jake said matter-of-factly, Carlos and I will set up better security systems around the ranch. Sheriff Bradley can increase patrols in the area. Sarah Kim can arrange for backup medical care if something happens to your regular doctor. The conversation continued past midnight, with both of them working through the practical details of what would essentially be a siege mentality until federal investigators could arrest David and his accomplices. Emma found herself drawing strength from Jake's calm competence, his ability to break complex problems down into manageable steps. When they finally went to their separate bedrooms, Emma lay awake listening to the absolute silence of the mountain night. The baby was restless too, moving frequently as if sensing her mother's mix of excitement and apprehension. For the first time since discovering David's criminal activities, Emma allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. She pictured her daughter growing up knowing that her mother had been brave enough to fight for justice. She imagined returning to veterinary school, perhaps working alongside Jake to expand the ranch's rescue program. Most surprisingly, she found herself envisioning a life where trust and love weren't weapons used to control and manipulate, but genuine foundations for building something lasting and good. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges and dangers that would test every ounce of courage she could muster. But for the first time in years, Emma Carter was no longer just running away from something. She was running toward a life she wanted to claim as her own, and that made all the difference in the world. In the morning, federal investigators would arrive to begin building their case. Sheriff Bradley would implement security measures designed to protect both Emma and Jake from retaliation. Rebecca Martinez would coordinate legal strategies that had successfully convicted other corrupt officers. The fight that would define the rest of Emma's life was about to begin, and she was as ready as anyone could be for a battle she'd never expected to fight. But tonight she was safe in Jake Bennett's mountain sanctuary, surrounded by the peace that came from making a decision that honored both her fears and her courage. The woman who'd arrived at his cabin 3 days ago had been running from her past. The woman who would face federal investigators tomorrow was ready to reclaim her future, whatever the cost might be. The federal agents arrived at dawn, their black SUVs winding up the mountain road like harbingers of the reckoning Emma had set in motion. Agent Patricia Reeves led the team, a compact woman in her 50s whose gray-streaked hair and no-nonsense demeanor spoke of decades spent pursuing criminals who thought their badges made them untouchable. She set up her equipment in Jake's living room with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted similar operations in remote locations before. Mrs. Carter, I want you to understand that what we're doing today changes everything, Agent Reeves said as she tested the recording equipment. Once you give this statement, there's no going back. David will know we're building a case, and he'll respond accordingly. Emma sat in Jake's reading chair, the same place she'd collapsed 3 weeks ago when she first sought shelter in his cabin. Now, instead of running from her past, she was confronting it with federal backing and the support of a man who'd taught her that healing required courage. Her hands rested on her 8-month belly, feeling her daughter's movements as a reminder of everything at stake. I understand, Emma said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I'm ready to tell you everything. The statement took 6 hours, with Emma detailing not just David's corruption but the systematic abuse that had escalated alongside his criminal activities. She described finding encrypted files on his computer, photographing bank records that showed payments from known drug dealers, discovering text messages between David and judges discussing case outcomes that hadn't been decided yet. Agent Reeves listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification but allowing Emma to tell her story in her own words. Jake remained in the kitchen during most of the session, close enough to provide support if needed, but far enough away to give Emma the space she required. He could hear the steady cadence of her voice through the thin cabin walls, noting how it grew stronger as the hours passed. This was not the terrified woman who'd broken into his home weeks ago, but someone who'd found her power and was wielding it with precision. When Agent Reeves finally turned off the recording equipment, Emma felt both drained and liberated. The secrets that had poisoned her marriage, the evidence that had made her a target, the truth about David's double life, it was all officially documented now, part of a federal investigation that would either destroy him or destroy her. Your testimony is compelling, and the physical evidence you provided corroborates everything you've told us. Agent Reeves said, packing her equipment with the same methodical care she'd used to set it up. We already have parallel investigations into several of the individuals you mentioned. Your husband's activities appear to be part of a larger network of corruption that extends across multiple law enforcement agencies. Emma leaned back in the chair, exhaustion washing over her. What happens now? We execute search warrants simultaneously across 4 states, seizing computers, financial records, and communication devices from everyone in David's network. The goal is to prevent them from coordinating their stories or destroying evidence. Agent Reeves paused, her expression becoming more personal. Emma, I need you to understand that the next few months are going to be extremely difficult. David and his allies will try everything to discredit your testimony. They'll claim you're mentally unstable, that you fabricated evidence, that your pregnancy has affected your judgment. They'll investigate every aspect of your life, looking for ammunition. I expected that, Emma said quietly. Rebecca Martinez warned me about the retaliation tactics they use. What you might not expect is how personal it becomes. They'll target Mr. Bennett here, anyone who's helped you, anyone who might testify on your behalf. Corruption cases involving law enforcement are unlike anything else because the defendants have access to investigative tools and legal knowledge that regular criminals don't possess. Jake appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately calming the anxiety that had begun building in Emma's chest. What kind of timeline are we looking at for the arrests? If everything goes according to plan, we'll have David and the primary conspirators in custody within 72 hours. But building cases strong enough to ensure convictions will take months, possibly over a year. Agent Reeves studied Jake's face, noting the determination there. Mr. Bennett, I understand you've become personally invested in Mrs. Carter's safety, but I need you to consider the risks you're accepting. David has already demonstrated he's willing to use violence to control his wife. When he realizes she's destroyed his criminal enterprise, that violence will escalate exponentially. Jake moved to stand behind Emma's chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Agent Reeves, 3 weeks ago, Emma arrived here carrying more courage than most people display in a lifetime. She could have disappeared completely, changed her identity, spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Instead, she chose to fight back against a system designed to protect corrupt officers like her husband. If you think I'm going to abandon her now, when she needs support most, you don't understand what kind of man I am. Emma reached up to cover one of Jake's hands with her own, drawing strength from his unwavering commitment. We know the risks, Agent Reeves. But we also know that hiding isn't a long-term solution. My daughter deserves to grow up in a world where criminals face consequences, even when they wear badges. Agent Reeves nodded, her expression softening slightly. I've been investigating police corruption for 15 years, and I can tell you that cases like yours are the reason I do this work. Officers who abuse their authority don't just harm their immediate victims. They undermine public trust in law enforcement, they enable other criminals to operate with impunity, and they make it harder for honest cops to do their jobs effectively. She handed Emma a secure phone, its display showing only emergency contact numbers. This connects directly to our operations center. If David or any of his associates attempt to contact you, if you see anything suspicious, if you need immediate extraction, use this phone. We have safe houses throughout the region and teams ready to respond within minutes. Emma stared at the device, its weight representing both protection and the acknowledgement that she was now living under constant threat. When will I know if the arrests were successful? I'll call you personally as soon as we have David in custody. But Emma, you need to understand that his arrest is just the beginning. He'll post bail, he'll have access to expensive lawyers, and he'll use every legal and illegal resource available to discredit your testimony. The most dangerous period will be between his arrest and his trial. After the federal agents departed, leaving tire tracks in the snow as evidence of their visit, Emma and Jake sat in the cabin's sudden quiet, both processing the magnitude of what they'd set in motion. Through the window, they could see the valley stretched out below them, peaceful and snow-covered, giving no indication of the storm of legal and personal consequences that was about to break over their lives. "Are you having second thoughts?" Jake asked, noting the way Emma kept turning the secure phone over in her hands. "No," Emma replied without hesitation. "Scared thoughts, worried thoughts, but not second thoughts. What David did to me, what he's been doing to the criminal justice system, it has to stop. Even if fighting back destroys me in the process, at least my daughter will know her mother tried to do the right thing." Jake moved to sit beside her on the small couch, close enough that their shoulders touched. "It won't destroy you. You're stronger than you know, and you're not fighting alone." Emma leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Over the past weeks, Jake had become more than just her protector or her friend. He'd become the person who reminded her daily that she was worthy of care, respect, and love. His quiet strength had helped her remember who she'd been before David's manipulation began reshaping her into someone smaller and more fearful. "Jake, I need to tell you something," Emma said, her voice soft but determined. "These past weeks with you, they've shown me what my life could be like without fear, without someone controlling every decision I make. You've reminded me that I'm capable of more than just surviving." He turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that made his heart accelerate. "Emma, I know the timing is complicated. I know we're about to face months of legal battles and potential danger. I know I'm 8 months pregnant with another man's child." Emma's voice grew stronger with each word. "But I also know that you've shown me what real love looks like. Not the possessive, controlling thing David called love, but something that makes me stronger instead of weaker." Jake cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Emma Carter, you walked into my life when I thought I was finished with love, finished with hope, finished with believing that good things could happen to broken people. You've reminded me that hearts can heal, that second chances are possible, that love doesn't have to end with loss." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, full of promise and possibility, rather than desperate need. When they broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against Jake's, feeling more complete than she had in years. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying weight beyond romance. They represented trust, hope, and the courage to believe in a future that extended beyond mere survival. "I love you too," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You and this little one, you're my family now. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The secure phone rang at 3:17 a.m., its shrill tone cutting through the mountain silence like a blade. Emma answered on the second ring, instantly alert, despite having been deeply asleep moments before. Jake sat up beside her, his hand automatically moving to the baseball bat he'd taken to keeping beside the bed. "Emma, it's Agent Reeves. We have David in custody, along with 6 co-conspirators including 2 judges and a federal prosecutor. The raids were successful, and we recovered enough evidence to support federal charges against the entire network." Emma felt her knees go weak with relief, even though she was already sitting on the bed. "Is it over? The arrests are complete, but as I warned you, this is just the beginning. David's lawyer is already filing motions claiming entrapment, illegal search and seizure, prosecutorial misconduct. They're going to argue that you fabricated evidence as revenge for a failing marriage." Emma had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still felt like a physical blow. "What do I need to do?" "For now, nothing. Stay where you are, stay safe, and let us handle the legal maneuvering. But Emma, I need to prepare you for what's coming. David's arrest is going to be front-page news by morning. Your identity as the whistleblower will probably be leaked within days. Are you ready for that level of public scrutiny?" Emma looked at Jake, seeing her own determination reflected in his steady gaze. "I'm ready, we're ready, good, get some rest if you can. Tomorrow, everything changes." The news broke at 6 a.m. Mountain Time, with local Denver stations leading their morning broadcasts with reports of a massive corruption sting that had netted a detective, 2 judges, a federal prosecutor, and several other high-ranking officials. By noon, national news outlets had picked up the story. with CNN and Fox News running competing versions of the scandal that had apparently been brewing for years. Emma watched the coverage from Jake's living room, fascinated and horrified to see her private nightmare becoming public entertainment. The reporters spoke in serious tones about the brave whistleblower whose testimony had exposed the corruption ring, but they had no idea what that testimony had cost, or what it would continue to cost in the months ahead. Mrs. Emma Carter, wife of arrested Detective David Carter, is currently in protective custody while federal investigators prepare their case. The CNN reporter announced, using a photo that must have been taken from Emma's social media accounts years ago. Sources close to the investigation describe her testimony as crucial to exposing a network of corruption that may have affected hundreds of criminal cases. Jake muted the television, pulling Emma closer against his side. "How does it feel seeing it all laid out like that?" Emma considered the question, watching her younger, more innocent face smile from the television screen. "Surreal, like they're talking about someone else's life." She paused, feeling the baby kick restlessly, but also validating. "For so long David convinced me that I was crazy, that I was imagining things, or misinterpreting what I saw. Now it's official. He really was everything I thought he was." The phone calls began that afternoon. Reporters had somehow obtained Jake's number, and they offered everything from exclusive interview opportunities to substantial payments for Emma's story. Rebecca Martinez fielded most of them, but she warned Emma that the pressure would only intensify as the case moved toward trial. "Celebrity domestic violence cases are a media feeding frenzy," Rebecca explained during their daily check-in call. "Everyone wants the exclusive story, the behind-the-scenes details, the human interest angle. You need to decide now how much of your privacy you're willing to sacrifice for this prosecution." Emma looked around Jake's cabin, at the simple furniture and mountain views that had become her sanctuary. In a few weeks, reporters might be camped outside these very windows, turning her refuge into a circus. The thought terrified her, but not enough to make her reconsider her choices. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure David and his friends face consequences," Emma said firmly. "If that means giving interviews, testifying in public, having every detail of my life scrutinized by strangers, then that's what I'll do. Even if it means putting Mr. Bennett at risk. The media attention will make his ranch a target for David's allies, people who might want to intimidate or harm you before you can testify." Emma felt Jake's hand tighten around hers, his silent communication that they were in this together regardless of consequences. "We've thought about that," Emma said. "Jake's installing additional security systems, Sheriff Bradley is increasing patrols in the area, and we have contingency plans if the situation becomes too dangerous." "What kind of contingency plans?" "Safe houses that Agent Reeves has arranged. We can be relocated within hours if necessary." Emma's voice remained steady, but inside she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety about the future's uncertainty. "But I'd rather stay here if possible. This place has become home." Rebecca's voice softened with understanding. "Emma, I've worked with dozens of women in situations similar to yours, and I need you to understand something. The strength you're showing, the courage it takes to stand up to someone like David, it's extraordinary. Most victims of law enforcement domestic violence never find the resources or support to fight back effectively. You're not just saving yourself and your daughter, you're paving the way for other women who might find themselves in similar situations." The weight of that responsibility settled over Emma like a mantle, both inspiring and intimidating. She'd begun this fight to protect her daughter and reclaim her own life, but now she understood that her actions had implications far beyond her personal circumstances. 2 weeks after David's arrest, Emma went into labor during a February snowstorm that blanketed the valley in 18 inches of fresh powder. The contractions began at 4 a.m., gentle at first but gradually intensifying until she could no longer pretend they were just false alarms. Jake woke to find her gripping the edge of their shared bed, breathing through waves of pain, with the focused concentration of someone preparing for battle. "Time?" he asked, instantly alert and reaching for the phone to call Dr. Kim. 5 minutes apart, Emma managed between contractions. "Has been for the last hour." Jake helped her dress and gather the bag they'd packed weeks ago. his movements calm and efficient despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily, and the roads would be treacherous, but they'd planned for this possibility. Carlos had already plowed the drive and was standing by with chains for the truck's tires. The drive to the hospital took 45 minutes instead of the usual 20, with Jake navigating carefully through snowdrifts while Emma breathed through contractions that were growing stronger and closer together. By the time they reached Valley General Hospital, she was fully in active labor and ready to meet the daughter she'd been protecting for months. Dr. Kim
Met them at the emergency entrance, her calm professionalism immediately reassuring. "Everything looks normal," she announced after a quick examination. "Baby's in perfect position, heartbeat is strong, and you're progressing exactly as we'd hope." The labor lasted 8 hours, with Jake holding Emma's hand through every contraction, reminding her to breathe, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was of her courage. When their daughter finally arrived at 2:47 p.m., screaming with indignation at her abrupt entry into the world, Emma felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible. "She's perfect," Dr. Kim announced, placing the baby on Emma's chest. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, 21 inches long, and absolutely beautiful. Emma stared down at her daughter's tiny face, seeing her own features mixed with traces of David that she chose to ignore. This child was hers, born free from her father's corruption and violence, protected by love rather than controlled by fear. "What's her name?" Jake asked softly, his finger tracing the baby's miniature hand. Emma had been considering names for months, but looking at her daughter's face, the decision became obvious. "Grace," she said. "Grace Hope Carter, because she represents new beginnings, second chances, and the hope that love can overcome anything." Jake smiled, understanding the significance of the names Emma had chosen. "Grace Hope Carter Bennett," he corrected gently. "She's going to be my daughter too, if you'll have me." Emma's tears were joyful as she nodded, knowing that Jake's commitment extended beyond romantic love to genuine parental devotion. Grace would grow up with a father who'd chosen her, who saw her as a gift rather than an obligation, who would teach her that love was meant to strengthen rather than control. The media discovered Grace's birth within hours, despite the hospital's attempts at privacy. By evening, reporters were camped outside Valley General, hoping for photographs or statements from the woman whose testimony was bringing down one of Colorado's largest corruption networks. Emma watched from her hospital room window, holding Grace against her chest, marveling at how this tiny person had already become part of a story much larger than either of them. "No interviews," Jake said firmly, when Rebecca Martinez called to discuss media strategy. "Not until Emma's recovered, not until we know Grace is safe, not until we can control the circumstances. The prosecutor wants Emma to do at least one major interview before the trial," Rebecca explained. "Something that humanizes her, shows the jury that she's credible, sympathetic, someone they can trust." Emma looked down at Grace's sleeping face, at the innocence that would soon be swept up in legal proceedings and public scrutiny. "I'll do whatever the case requires," she said quietly. "But I want assurances that Grace's privacy will be protected, that her face won't be shown, that her life won't become entertainment for people who don't understand what we've been through. I'll make sure those conditions are written into any media agreements," Rebecca promised. "Emma, you've given us everything we need to convict David and his co-conspirators. The evidence is overwhelming, your testimony is compelling, and now you have even more reason to ensure they face consequences." Emma kissed Grace's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of new life and unlimited possibilities. "Yes," she agreed, her voice filled with maternal fierce protectiveness. "Now I have even more reason to make sure they never hurt anyone again." The trial began 6 months later, with Emma taking the witness stand in a federal courthouse packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and family members of other corruption victims. Grace, now crawling and babbling her first words, stayed with Anna Mendez during the proceedings, protected from the media circus that surrounded her mother's testimony. Emma spoke for 3 days, detailing David's crimes with clinical precision, while also describing the escalating abuse that had accompanied his descent into corruption. The defense attorneys tried every tactic Agent Reeves had predicted, claiming Emma was unstable, vindictive, motivated by financial gain rather than justice. But her testimony held firm, corroborated by the physical evidence she'd gathered, and the testimonies of other victims who'd found the courage to come forward. When the verdicts were read, David received 18 years in federal prison,
with his co-conspirators receiving sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The corruption network that had operated with impunity for over a decade was finally dismantled, and the justice system began the long process of reviewing hundreds of cases that might have been affected by their crimes. Emma sat in the courtroom as the sentences were announced, feeling not triumph, but a profound sense of closure. The man who'd controlled and terrorized her was finally facing consequences for his actions. The criminal enterprise that had corrupted the legal system was destroyed. The fight that had begun in Jake's mountain cabin had finally reached its resolution. 5 years later, Emma graduated from veterinary school with honors, her thesis focusing on trauma recovery in rescue animals. She'd completed her degree through a combination of online classes and clinical rotations that accommodated her responsibilities as Grace's mother and Jake's partner in expanding Meadowbrook Ranch's rescue program. Grace, now a precocious 5-year-old with her mother's determination and Jake's gentle nature, helped with the daily care of horses that arrived broken and left whole. She called Jake Daddy, and had no memory of the chaos that had preceded her birth, growing up instead in an environment where love meant protection rather than possession. The ranch had become a model program for equine therapy, hosting visitors from across the country who wanted to learn Jake and Emma's methods for healing damaged animals. Emma's veterinary expertise combined with Jake's intuitive understanding of trauma created an approach that produced remarkable results, with horses that other facilities had deemed hopeless finding new lives and new purposes. On quiet evenings, when Grace was asleep and the mountain air carried the contented sounds of horses settling in for the night, Emma and Jake would sit on their porch and marvel at the journey that had brought them together. The woman who'd broken into his cabin during a snowstorm had become his wife, his partner, and the mother of their expanded family. The man who'd offered shelter to a desperate stranger had rediscovered his purpose in protecting and healing those who couldn't protect themselves. "Do you ever regret fighting back instead of just disappearing?" Jake asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Emma considered the question, thinking about the years of legal battles, media scrutiny, and personal challenges that had followed her decision to expose David's corruption. Then she looked through the kitchen window at Grace, who was coloring at the table while humming one of the songs Carlos Mendez had taught her. "Never," Emma said firmly. "Grace is growing up in a world where her mother stood up to a bully and won. Where criminals face consequences even when they wear badges. Where love means building someone up instead of tearing them down." She reached for Jake's hand, intertwining their fingers as naturally as breathing. "She's growing up knowing that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite being afraid." Jake brought their joined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "She's also growing up knowing that families can be built from choice rather than just biology. That healing is possible even after the worst trauma, and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Emma smiled, remembering the terrified woman who'd sought shelter in a stranger's cabin years ago. That woman could never have imagined the life she'd eventually build, the family she'd claim, the purpose she'd discover in turning her pain into protection for others. As the stars appeared above the valley, and the horses settled into their evening routines, Emma reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed her greatest vulnerability into her greatest strength. The pregnancy that had made her a target had also given her the courage to fight back. The fear that had driven her into hiding had ultimately led her to love. The trauma that had nearly destroyed her had become the foundation for helping others heal. Grace's laughter drifted through the open window, mixing with the evening sounds of a ranch where broken creatures learned to trust again. Emma closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of healing that surrounded her, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest storms. "You need healing, I need purpose," Jake had whispered to her that first night, though neither of them had understood then how prophetic those words would prove to be. Now years later, they'd discovered that healing and purpose were not separate destinations but different facets of the same journey. Love had taught them both that the heart's capacity for renewal was infinite. That second chances were not just possible but inevitable when courage met compassion in the quiet spaces where hope chose to grow. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and possibility across the valley, while inside their home, Grace's voice rose in song, celebrating a world where her mother's courage had made all the difference. Emma Bennett Nee Carter had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not just survive your storms, but help others find shelter from theirs. And in that lesson, she'd found not just healing, but home. The courthouse steps gleamed wet under October rain as Emma descended them for the final time, her hand clasped firmly in Jake's. The jury had deliberated only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against David and his criminal network. Emma paused at the bottom steps, turning back toward the federal building where she'd spent 3 days on the witness stand, reliving her worst memories for strangers. The woman entering that courtroom had been strong but still carried traces of David's instilled fear. The woman emerging felt fundamentally different, as if testifying had burned away the last remnants of victimhood. "How do you feel?" Rebecca Martinez asked, joining them under the overhang. The advocate had become more than legal support over the past year, transforming into a trusted friend who understood the unique challenges of fighting law enforcement corruption. Emma considered carefully, empty in a good way. "Like I've carried this enormous weight so long I forgot what standing straight felt like." She touched her chest, where anxiety had lived for years. "It's gone. That constant fear, David's voice telling me I was crazy or weak. He can't hurt me anymore." Jake's arm tightened around her waist, his quiet strength reminding her how much her life had changed since that desperate night she'd sought shelter in his cabin. "Appeals could take years. David's lawyers won't give up easily." "Let them appeal," Emma said with conviction. "The evidence is overwhelming, and other victims have found courage to come forward. David will spend 18 years in federal prison with his network destroyed. Even reduced sentences won't put him in position to hurt anyone again." Rebecca smiled, recognizing the transformation in her client. "Emma, you've accomplished something remarkable. Not just for yourself, but for every victim of law enforcement domestic violence who'll benefit from precedents we've set. The federal task force investigating police corruption will use your testimony as a prosecution model." That responsibility had initially terrified Emma, but now felt like purpose. Her private nightmare had become public victory, protecting other women facing similar circumstances. Evidence she'd risked everything to gather had exposed corruption across multiple states, resulting in convictions of David, 2 federal judges, a prosecutor, and 6 other officials. The drive back to Blue Ridge Valley took 3 hours through mountain roads painted in autumn colors. Emma dozed against Jake's shoulder, emotionally drained but peaceful in ways she hadn't felt in years. When she woke, they were turning into the familiar gravel drive leading to Meadowbrook Ranch, where Grace played in the yard under Anna Mendez's watchful eye. At 18 months, Grace was a sturdy toddler with Emma's dark hair and adventurous spirit. She spotted the truck immediately, abandoning toys and running toward them with the unsteady gait of someone still mastering bipedal locomotion. Jake scooped her up before she reached gravel, spinning her until she shrieked with delighted laughter. "Mama Dada," Grace proclaimed, reaching for Emma with chubby arms. The easy way she called Jake Dada never failed to move Emma. Grace had no memory of David, no awareness of chaos preceding her birth. To her, Jake had always been father, the man reading bedtime stories, teaching her to feed horses, carrying her on evening walks around the ranch. Anna appeared from the house, wiping hands on a dish towel and smiling broadly. "How did it go?" "Carlos has been pacing all afternoon waiting for news." "Guilty on all counts," Jake announced with satisfaction. "David got 18 years federal prison, no parole possibility, for 12. Anna's expression turned fierce with maternal protectiveness. "Good. That man deserved worse for what he put Emma through." She took Grace, settling the toddler with practiced ease. "This little one's been asking for mama all day." I think she knew something important was happening. Emma looked at her daughter, marveling at resilience and joy radiating despite traumatic conception circumstances. Grace represented everything good growing from worse situations. Proof that love could triumph over violence if given chance to flourish. "I want to see the horses," Emma said, surprising herself with sudden need to reconnect with animals that had been part of her healing journey. "I need to remember why all this was worth it." They walked to the barn together, Grace chattering happily while Jake and Anna discussed ranch operations continuing during their absence. Familiar scents of hay and leather welcomed Emma like an embrace, immediately grounding her in present moments rather than legal battles dominating recent months. Star approached her paddock fence, no longer the traumatized mare who'd arrived years ago but a confident horse who'd learned to trust again. Emma extended her hand, smiling as Star investigated her fingers before allowing petting. The transformation was remarkable. from an animal attacking anyone who came near to one actively seeking human companionship. She's been asking for you, Jake observed, watching the interaction. Every day you were gone, she'd come to the fence when hearing the truck, looking disappointed when you weren't in it. Emma felt tears gathering, moved by simple loyalty of an animal once as damaged as she'd been. I missed her too, missed all of this. She gestured around the barn, taking in horses who'd found sanctuary here, evidence of healing surrounding them on all sides. Thunder, the massive draft horse once used for illegal fighting, stood peacefully while Grace babbled at him from Anna's arms. Belle, the paint mare who'd arrived, starved nearly to death, grazed contentedly in afternoon sun. Each animal represented success stories, lives reclaimed from trauma and given new purpose. I want to expand the program, Emma said, ideas crystallizing as she spoke. Not just student rotations, but a formal training center for veterinarians and therapists specializing in trauma recovery. Certification programs, research protocols, published findings. Jake studied her face, seeing excitement appearing when Emma discussed animal work. That would require significant investment. Buildings, equipment, staff. Foundation money from lawsuit settlements could fund it, Emma replied, referring to civil judgments against David and co-conspirators. Rather than keeping money for personal use, she'd established a foundation helping law enforcement domestic violence victims. What better use for David's ill-gotten gains than creating something helping other victims heal? 6 months later, Emma stood before the newly constructed Healing Hearts Center, watching the first group of veterinary students tour specialized trauma recovery facilities. Buildings were beautiful in their simplicity, constructed from local stone and timber blending seamlessly with mountain landscape. Grace toddled between students, her confident chatter drawing smiles from young adults learning that healing could be as much about joy as pain. At 2 years old, she displayed intuitive understanding of animal behavior, impressing even experienced veterinarians, knowing instinctively which horses needed gentle approaches versus confident energy. She's going to be natural at this work, observed Dr. Patricia Chen, the program director Emma had recruited from Colorado State University's veterinary school. I've never seen a child so young read animal emotions so accurately. Emma watched her daughter approach Thunder fearlessly, extending tiny hands while speaking in babbling half-language all toddlers use. Thunder lowered his great head to investigate, breath ruffling Grace's dark curls as he accepted her greeting. She's never known these animals as anything but gentle, Emma explained. To her, the idea that horses might hurt humans is incomprehensible. They respond to that absolute trust. That evening, after students departed and Grace slept, Emma sat in her study working on final chapters of her book. The manuscript had grown beyond initial vision, incorporating case studies from Healing Hearts Center along with human trauma recovery research. Publishers were expressing interest, and she'd been invited to speak at veterinary conferences nationwide. Jake appeared carrying 2 teacups, settling into his usual chair beside her desk. How's it coming along? I'm writing about Grace, Emma said, gesturing toward her computer screen. About how children growing up around healing develop intuitive recovery understanding that takes adults years to learn. Jake smiled, thinking about their daughter's fearless interactions with animals still intimidating experienced handlers. She's going to read this someday and realize her childhood was completely unique. I hope she reads it and realizes healing is always possible, that love can overcome any trauma given enough time and patience. Emma replied. She saved her work and faced him fully. Jake, do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found your cabin that night? Sometimes, he admitted. But I try not dwelling on alternate histories. We found each other when we needed each other most. Everything else is just details. Emma reached for his hand, intertwining fingers with unconscious ease of long intimacy. I used to think love meant giving up parts of yourself to make someone else happy. David convinced me compromise meant becoming smaller, quieter, more convenient. And now I know real love makes you bigger, stronger, more yourself rather than less. She gestured around the study, walls lined with veterinary texts and recovered horse photographs. Everything good in my life has grown from learning that difference. The baby monitor crackled softly, as Grace stirred in sleep, murmuring disconnected dream words. Mama, Dada, horses, safe. Emma smiled, hearing in her daughter's sleepy vocabulary the complete summary of their life together. Grace would grow up knowing families could be chosen, that love meant protection rather than control, that healing was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. Outside, an owl called from the forest, and Star whinnied softly in response from her paddock. Night sounds seemed to carry messages of contentment, of lives finding proper places, of wounds transformed into wisdom. Emma closed her laptop and reached for Jake's hand, ready to end another day in the life they'd built through courage, persistence, and radical belief that broken things could be made whole again. The story, beginning with desperate flight, had become one of purposeful building, and in that transformation, both had discovered what it meant to truly come home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.